oceans, and all of these sets of feedbacks that fit with them. So that's another area I think we need to bring into the mix, really.
So, segueing again, it's possible to only examine part of a problem and then think you've examined all of it. So, talking about the Committee on Climate Change's recent net zero report, we were at a seminar last week and you expressed a certain amount of displeasure with the report and the response to it from most academics. Could you recap? Being aware that you're now being filmed.
Well, let's start. As I did tweet after the report, and I put a small comment on the Science Media Centre along with lots of other academics. And I would say that I'm really pleased we have the Committee on Climate Change, and I think I think the Climate Change Act in the UK is still, in my interpretation, is still the best piece of legislation out there. I don't think we've done it service, but I think it's still an excellent piece of legislation. It's 2008, and the new climate law in Sweden in 2018, I don't think is as well advanced as the Climate Change Act in the UK. And I'm really
thank you, Friends of the Earth.
Yes, and a lot of people involved in that. And thank you for the Tickle Centre. So we were heavily involved in some of that. But yes, okay. There were a huge swathe of people involved, and it was, I think, the bill the act that passed with more support than any other bill in history. I think only about 4 people either didn't vote for it.
The Conservative Party, which was in opposition at the time, had a campaign, "Can we have the bill, please?" Which is unimaginable now, but those were the days.
So I'm pleased we've got the Act, I'm pleased we've got the Committee on Climate Change, and I think the Secretariat are excellent, and I'm really pleased with their new chair. So Chris Stark, he seems to me to be excellent. I have been very disappointed with the commissioners from the beginning, and not as individuals. I think, in and of themselves, they've all been really pretty much high calibre individuals, but I think as soon as they moved into that role, they've taken on a much more political perspective, and that includes the scientists across the board. So I think the commissioners have not served the committee secretariat well as well. So and this is going to be challenging to some people to hear, but I did write about this, and actually I engaged with Sam Frankenhauser, who did the review. He used to be on the committee of this for I think it was for the EU. I think he did the review for. So I did make my comments, very clear then. Then they never made it into the public domain. I hasten to add when the report came out. And so when they could produce this report, this was the first big report with Chris as the chair. I had some significant hopes for it, and we had submitted some evidence along with lots of other academics for them to consider. And I think it was a real damp squib of a report. And the more I've looked at it, the more I'm disappointed by it. I think it's highly political.
Okay.
It relies on a huge amount of negative emissions. It keeps going about what's feasible, and in other words, only what we've suggested is feasible, other things aren't. And the other things are, again, it's that closing down of the debate, the whole swathe of things that we might do on the social and cultural aspects that don't fit with a particular economic model that the CCC have chosen to be closely aligned
because it would be nanny state or interventionist or something?
Well, I'm not. Well, perhaps that's how they would call it. I think climate change is interventionist.
Yes.
Having sea level rise imposed upon you is interventionist. When we are knowingly doing it, it's not as if we're not aware of this, we've been aware of it for a long time. So there is not a non-interventionist approach to climate change. It's just who do we think we should intervene on? The high emitters causing the problem, or those people who suffer the impacts? But it was more than that. They just stuck with the standard political paradigm, and they repeatedly hide behind this idea we don't want to dictate policies. They do dictate policies. But by omission, they are dictating policies, that what is feasible, what is appropriate to consider. They had the word equity sprinkled throughout the report, and I hardly saw any reference to the substance of equity within the report, despite repeated reference to it. So there's very little discussion about the high emitters, about how do we drive change in those people who are responsible for most emissions within the UK. That discussion wasn't there. There was no discussion at the end of the day that climate change is innately a rationing issue. We have a certain carbon budget, which they do have, but they didn't have that laid out clearly within the report. We have a certain carbon budget, and which we then have to divide amongst the sectors or the individuals or the cities, and we have to find some way of dealing with that. That is a rationing issue. But that framing of it wasn't considered. So I do think that they've become part of the problem, and they managed to resolve all of this, of course, with negative emissions. Not solely with negative emissions, a lot of other tech solutions that are in there. We run through some cost-benefit analysis with a high discount rate for the future about speculative costs and prices that we have no idea about in 2030 to 2070. And hey presto, what it says is delay action. Now, okay, they are pushing for some action as well, but it's nothing like what would be necessary for 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So the two big issues to me, one is firstly, they decided to take, as far as we can interpret from it, but they had done this before as well, a much larger share of the global carbon pie, the global carbon budget, than would be fair for the UK, which I just see as an extension of our colonial approach to we deserve more because we're British. Now, it's true probably every other country is doing something similar. And then the second one was they're relying very heavily on some pretty speculative technologies to work in the future when the chair of the chair and some of the more senior people in the CCC will be either pushing up datas or retired to Tuscany, and the repercussions of that sort of report will then be felt by the next generation. So this has been my ongoing concern with the CCC, that they have not opened up the debate, opened up the space. They've closed the space down, and they've not only closed the space down in terms of what the policymakers may think about, they've significantly closed the space down in terms of what the academics discuss. It's almost that the CCC, I almost seem to be sort of like some peer-reviewed academic arbiter of what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate, and that's not what it is at all. It's a semi-autonomous, but has a high degree of close alignment with the government. It's not independent of Parliament anyway. As it often claims, I think that's been really disingenuous to say it is independent of Parliament. It has chosen a particular perspective right from the beginning. And I've seen it almost to some extent as part of the problem. And I think that's a real shame because, as I said before, I think the Secretariat are excellent. They can do some really very good work, and their individual technical reports are really excellent pieces of work. It's just their collective framing of the agenda, I think, is just this short of fraudulent.
What you're saying puts me in mind of what Herman and Chomsky called the propaganda model, setting the limits of acceptable sort of mainstream debate, and if you go any further than such a point, you can be dismissed as an eco-loon in this case. It's
the doves and the hawks, but really there's no such thing as a dove. It's just it's a hawk, a sparrowhawk or a kestrel. That's about the range that we get. And I think the CCC have done that. And I think, to be honest, I think that is inevitably an outcome of how the commissioners have chosen to address these issues. I think the commissioners had been more resistant to a political framing. One, of course, that most of them are not equipped to deal or address that, and I don't think that's their role. I mean, like my position is, most of us academics, our job is to be academic. Is to be indifferent to political and economic sensibilities. That's our job. Isn't to think what can the political realm deal with and then deliver what they want to hear. We're not there to fine tune our analysis or edit our work to fit with that model. And we should be robust as academics, but we haven't been robust. And I think other academics have been the same. It's not as if it's just the CCC. And it's particularly talking about mitigation here. Most of the academic community that I'm aware of has played this game of fine-tuning their assumptions to deliver something that fits with the political model. Now, having said that, I think there are some, usually younger, but not always, usually some earlier career researchers are starting to question some of these issues. And there is now a wider discussion around some of the cultural and the social aspects. There's a new climate change centre starting that's going to be looking at some of these social dimensions.
The one in Cardiff.
The one in Cardiff, and it's linked here to some of my colleagues in Manchester as well. So I think that has some real, things like that are very good. There's one in Bergen looking at this, unfortunately funded by what we used to know as Statoil, now Equinor, but there are some excellent people there doing some excellent work. So there are these centres now looking at some of these issues.
I didn't realise the Bergen outfit was funded that way, because I've got, there's a job going that I'm going to maybe apply for.
Yeah, well, there's some very, very good people there. Okay. So I'm often very concerned about the funding, and I certainly am there. And I was actually giving their keynotes at the opening of the centre with the Statoil representative and the Environment Minister from Norway. And it was interesting to see when we started to play that out in the discussion, how it was viewed. But a lot of the academics there have managed to maintain quite a high degree of autonomy from Statoil. It's much easier for them in Norway. I mean, they've got so much money they don't know what to do with it. I mean, Norway is awash with money.
They've even got a sovereign wealth fund, and talk to your average Australian about how nice that would be.
Yeah, well, it's 200. Very roughly, it's 200,000 euros per adult person in Norway.
Just don't start me.
So I use that when I talk quite a bit in Norway as well about some of these issues, and say that really Norway should be demonstrating some leadership by phasing out its oil industry very rapidly, because it's got so much money in the bank, it does not require that industry.
But they've got free charging for your Tesla, so that's fine.
Well, they claim their oil is greener because the energy they use to get it out of the ground is actually generally more greener energy. But
there is no limit to the stories that humans can tell themselves. But I think really.
Well, I think Norway and the UK are quite interesting here in that they're both very wealthy countries that have really bought into the climate change agenda, and both of them have done very significantly, and yet they're not prepared to phase out their oil and gas industries. And I think until we have examples like that, and they're probably the two prime examples here that really engage in issues of climate change, really got good academic background behind all of that as well. They've got political buy-in to those sets of issues, which the UK still has significantly, and Norway has, and yet it still will not look to phase out its oil and gas industry. Both of them are still exploring for more oil and gas.
So 2 final questions on the national level before we come down to the local. In terms of empty words, the parliamentary declaration, as opposed to government declaration, parliamentary declaration of a climate emergency, a footnote in history or a turning point?
Well, I'm not sure there are turning points. That goes back to things being much more emergent. I mean, is it better to have it or not have it? Probably to have it. But is it particularly important in the dialogues that are ongoing at the moment? It's a nice to have, I think. We don't know how it might play out. Maybe it'll play out. Maybe it's enough to convince someone to make some significant change within government, or their voices be heard. And that's the benefit of emergent systems, is that you put what you can into it, and you don't really know what's going to pop out elsewhere. No. Maybe nothing will pop out, but maybe some things will. And maybe it encourages other governments to think these things through as well. So I'm not opposed to it. But
it might change the mood music a bit.
Yeah, we'll change it a little bit, one way or another. Whether it has any big impact or not, we'll have to wait and see.
So as opposed to empty words, we've had these anti-fracking campaigners out there in all weather.
Yeah.
And they seem to be winning.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I really never quite understood the government's pursuance of fracking in this country, because we're a population-dense country.
Not in the desolate north. No one important lives in Lancashire.
Well, there are a sufficient number of people to cause a lot of problems for any developer. So I suppose we're locked. Some of the people are locked into a mid-20th century mindset of what the future is going to look like, and they cannot escape somewhere between 1950 and 1980.
The good old days.
The good old days, yeah. And so, yes, this is another marvellous hydrocarbon resource. I mean, unlike the North Sea, which was a long way from anywhere, this is under people's houses. Mm-hmm. And the trucks that will have to come and go regularly will be passing people's houses. The noise will be near people's houses. And then there's all the water will be there, and then there's all the other issues that are more or less important, like the earthquakes and so forth. So we can make our own judgments on those. But it's a nasty, noisy industrial process, and fracking does require ongoing engagement with the production wells, unlike if you look at something like Witch Farm, where you basically put a hole in the ground and you can leave it to run for the next 20 or 30 years, put a little environmental bund around it and you can't see it. That's not how fracking works. So to think that we could take something from the wildernesses of parts of Pennsylvania and then translate that to the middle of population-dense Lancashire, where we're not even sure what the plays are like for the gas. At the time when renewable prices are absolutely plummeting, and there's this rise over issues of climate change, and the government says we can't have any onshore wind turbines, but so perfectly okay to have lots of fracking. And I just find it really almost quite bizarre that this pursuance of this technology. But I think it's again partly that we're locked into a particular way of looking at the world. It's extractivism, and also fossil fuels are incredibly energy dense. They have something that's attractive about them, which is very hard for the renewables and other technologies to compete with. And if you haven't got the innovative capacity and the imaginative capacity to think beyond that system, then you can sort of see why it looks still quite attractive. But I think the political repercussions of it, regardless of your party, people think from all sorts of walks of life have been significantly opposed to this, and not necessarily because of the climate change agenda. That's been party to this as well, but I think all of the other local issues have been hugely important. So I think it is one of those examples where government has been a bit out of touch with the local populations, or perhaps they're simply not interested in a decentralised view of the energy system, or even of the UK, and they just think they can impose what they want from London.
Just to overrule the Lancashire Council's firm I don't know if it was unanimous, but it was a very clear signal.
Yeah.
And then London just goes, no, you're having it.
Yes, yeah, I think there are real problems with it from that perspective. But we are still exploring for more oil and gas. Claire Perry comes out, claims 1 minute to consider about climate change, next minute she's celebrating the new Glengorm gas and the Clay Ridge oil and gas fields in the North Sea. And the Clay Ridge one is around about 250 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, and the Glengorm gas field, if that goes ahead, is going to be another 100 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. How on earth does that fit into addressing issues of climate change?
It's going to be hard to explain 20 years in the future.
Yeah.
We may have other more pressing things to worry about.
It's easy to explain now because the academics have stayed quiet.
We're going to come back to the academics. Moving now, having done international and national, let's move on to the local. 3 questions. The first, the recent Mayor's Green Summit, which I was not at, but there was talk of the gap between sort of what the existing policies might deliver and what the ambition was. Is this sort of a way, putting it on the table and admitting it already, is this a way of just normalising failure and getting people used to the shrugging of the shoulders?
Well, perhaps it is, but it's not one that everyone's adopted for a long time. We have the UN gap report that's produced every year for the different COPs. So there is always this huge gap between what the commitments that we make, what the science says broadly aligns with those commitments, and then what we actually are delivering on the policy realm. And that gap has got bigger and bigger and more challenging because every year we have failed. So every year our emissions go up, and every year that means that it begs more fundamental questions of the current paradigm. We probably could have solved the problem with the usual technocratic solutions if we'd started a long time ago. We chose to fail. Not only did we choose to fail and the emissions remain static, we chose to fail and the emissions have rocketed. So now the carbon budget is so small that those technocratic solutions are no longer viable. But we're not yet in a position where we're prepared to sort of start to think about things that are more fundamentally embedded in our system, more things that are more profound in terms of change. We're not prepared to think like that yet. So I think that to some extent that gap gets bigger and bigger until we are prepared to step over that threshold and start to ask questions of things that we previously weren't prepared to ask questions about. And that, again, to me, is significant the role of the NGOs, civil society, and particularly academics to be driving that agenda. And to some extent, not only the academics, but some of the NGOs, I think, have chosen to fail, particularly some of the more glitterati elements of the NGOs have chosen to fail on this. So yes, there is a gap between that. Is it used just to are we trying to normalise it? I think that'd be almost too Machiavellian. I don't think that's the case. I think most of the people I've come across who engage in these issues are actually genuinely concerned about them. I don't think but they are locked into the current system. They're not often the people who are going to think differently. And so I think there are some problems in that we have not got the right people yet, right at sort of the senior level, prepared to drive these changes. And unfortunately, when they listen to the voices that are talking to them, the rest of us have been sufficiently co-opted not to sort of question their worldview. But I think if we heard...
With the honourable exception of Manchester Climate Monthly.
Well, yeah, there are a few honourable exceptions here and there, but I think and those questions are being asked now. And this is why, partly going back to my comments earlier, this is why I felt the CCC report was disappointing. Yes. I think the CCC report could have been understood perhaps in 2005, but the idea in 2019 they produced that report, which in some respects I think is even weaker than their previous position because of the level of nets and so forth in there, and also the ongoing use of aviation, which they've allowed to carry on.
Till 2033, I think they said.
Well, I mean, the significant emissions from aviation out to 2050. I mean, it's hardly coming down at all. I mean, I think their core scenario broadly has it the same as it was in 2005-ish, so it's staying on at that sort of level. So, no, actually, I think I can't remember, it might have been an increase since 2005, but I mean, there's a lot of aviation emissions that are still occurring in 2050 with no clear picture of when does it go down to zero.
Let's drag, because of aviation and because of the gap, let's drag you along to the hyper-local level now, down from Greater Manchester level to Manchester City Council. I'm sure you're aware that there's a Climate Emergency Manchester petition.
Yeah, I gather, yeah.
And it is putting the demand that Manchester City Council declare a climate emergency and then create a plan for zero carbon by 2030 with a proportionate share of the aviation emissions from the airport, which of course the City Council owns 35.5% of. My first question is it actually physically possible for a connected both nationally and internationally city like Manchester to eat with all of the political will. Do you see any viable pathways, means by which a city could get within spitting distance, meaningful spitting distance of zero carbon in 10 and a half years? You're allowed to say no, it's a pipe dream. We're adults.
Well, I think but I think we have to be careful to say no. In isolation, if no one else was doing anything, and if they were to continue to do nothing, I think probably it would be fairly clear that no would be the answer. However, you could also postulate Manchester genuinely trying to go down that route, and that triggering some other cities. So perhaps Oslo follows suit, maybe Nottingham, maybe Bristol. Maybe then we start to see Paris and some other cities maybe start to follow a similar route. Now, if that started happening in 3 or 4 years, you could start a new momentum which we would hard to anticipate today. But you could write a scenario, and when you look back on it, you think we can see what happened. It's hard to predict that in advance, but you can sort of see that. I mean, who would have guessed Extinction Rebellion or Greta Thunberg, or even if you went back a bit further, who would have guessed 1.5 degrees centigrade in 2014? Yeah. So I think if everything else stays as it is, ceteris paribus, no, we won't see that. But the world doesn't stay as it is, and actually, it may well be if Manchester tried to do that, it could be the catalyst. Now, could it deliver on that sort of reduction? I think the idea was to try to deliver on it, and if we fail because we only have an 80% reduction by 2030, well, okay, that's considerably better than where we're heading at the moment. So, yes, I think we should be trying. But I think we can't just try with the normal set of tools. We have to start to try and think differently. I think we still think we can solve climate change and the rest of the world can just carry on as it is. I mean, this just completely misses the scale of the challenge that we're actually facing and where most of the emissions come from. So if you just look at a city like Manchester, the huge inequity we see around, let's take it Greater Manchester particularly, the huge inequity we see there. Lots of people living around here are relatively low emitters. And the last thing we want to do is make their lives more difficult. We want to make their lives improved.
People in Ardwick or parts of Rochdale or...
But huge, yeah. I mean, a lot of people here who rented homes or...
Wigan.
All over.
All over?
Yeah, all over.
Where I'm from,
and a huge proportion of these people. And we do not want to make their lives more difficult. But I think there are ways, though I'm quite sceptical a lot of these, always that everything's a win-win. It's not always a win-win. But I think for some of those people, if those people in charge would genuinely understood the scale of the challenge we face, you could for these communities see win-win in sort of retrofitting their homes, in terms of massive improvements in air quality, in terms of a really good jobs agenda, high-quality jobs agenda for probably 2 generations at least. There's a lot that you could do there, but that isn't free. That will mean that those of us that are high emitters, when I go cycling out in Cheshire, I regularly see them, and probably I'm one of those as well. We will have to see significant additional reductions from that group, because in the short term you're going to see rising emissions from the poorer communities, those in fuel poverty and so forth. But I think you can write a positive agenda for them, for a large swathe of the people living in and around Manchester. From the sort of low income through to some of the middle incomes, or the average incomes anyway. But that does mean that those of us on higher emitters, and that's many of us in universities who don't like to think of ourselves as being high income and high emitters, but we're in that category with a few exceptions. That the implications for us are really very profound, and no leaders are prepared to tackle that yet. They always think they can do it with a bit of kit bolted on somewhere, and that's going to resolve the issue.